In the middle of the Indian Ocean lies a place that should have been forgotten, a strip of sand so small and barren that most sailors would not have given it a second glance. Tromelin Island was never meant to carry the weight of history. To the eye, it was nothing more than a desolate sandbar, little more than coral, scrub grass, and endless wind. But in 2006, when archaeologists first set foot on this island, they unearthed something extraordinary. Beneath the ruins of an old French weather station built in the 1950s, their shovels struck not seabird bones as expected, but human bones. And alongside them lay fragments of a life once lived here. Copper spoons beaten into shape from salvaged ship metal, bowls made from wreckage, jewelry strung together with shells, and the stone foundations of crude shelters built to resist the wrath of tropical cyclones. The story written in those bones and artifacts was not one of natural history, but of human survival. 15 long years of exile endured by men and women who should never have been left behind. To understand how those bones came to rest on such a forsaken shore, we must step back into the year 1760, to a time when colonial ambition, greed, and betrayal collided upon the waves. In November of that year, in the port of Bayonne, France, a transport ship called l'Utile prepared to set sail. Built for carrying cargo rather than passengers, she was commanded by Captain Jean de Lafarge and manned by a crew of 140. The mission seemed routine: sail to Île-de-France, modern-day Mauritius, and deliver supplies to the French colony. But when l'Utile reached her destination in April of 1761, new orders awaited the captain. Governor Antoine de Forges-Boucher pulled Lafargue aside with explicit instructions. Because France was at war with Britain and the colony faced critical food shortages, the captain was forbidden to traffic enslaved people back to the island. Lafargue listened, nodded, and appeared to accept the order. But the lure of profit proved too strong. On June 27, 1761, the ship left Port Louis under cover of night and sailed for Madagascar. At the port of Fall Point, a notorious center of the slave trade, Lafargue struck his illegal bargain. He purchased 160 Malagasy men and women, most of them from the Betsimisaraka people of Madagascar's eastern highlands. They were herded aboard like cargo, forced into the hold of the ship, where they were packed so tightly that breathing itself became a struggle. At night, the hatches were nailed shut to prevent even the slightest chance of rebellion. Among those trapped below was a young woman named Timavo. Her name, in Malagasy, meant the humble one. She did not yet know that she carried a child within her. That unborn child would later become the youngest survivor of one of history's darkest abandonments. The ship left Madagascar on July 27th, heavy with its illegal human cargo. Captain Lafargue, desperate to avoid British patrols, plotted a secretive route and relied on outdated maps, some drawn as far back as 1740. These charts misplaced the position of a dangerous reef by nearly 30 miles. On the night of July 31st, disaster struck. At 10 o'clock, the first officer on duty spotted white water ahead. It was not the breaking of waves, but the deadly foam of coral reef. Before he could shout a warning, l'Utile drove into the reef at full speed. The rudder snapped instantly, and the hull split apart as waves hurled the vessel against the coral. Below deck, panic erupted. The enslaved Malagasy pounded on the nailed hatches, screaming to be freed, screaming to be saved. Some managed to smash their way out, but most remained trapped in the darkness. Water rushed in as the ship groaned and shattered. By dawn, the toll was devastating. 18 French sailors had drowned, but the cost for the Malagasy was far worse. 72 lives lost, many of them still imprisoned below when the sea swallowed the ship. Yet, out of this chaos, 210 people survived. 122 French crew members and 88 enslaved Malagasy dragged themselves onto a barren sandbar that would soon become both their refuge and their prison, Tromelin Island. The survivors found themselves marooned on a land as merciless as the sea that had stranded them. Flat as a table, rising no more than 8 meters above sea level, the island offered no trees, no shelter, and no fresh water. Only the searing sun by day and the relentless winds by night. Captain Lafargue, overwhelmed with guilt and terror at the punishment awaiting him for his illegal slaving, collapsed into a near catatonic state. Command of the group fell instead to the first officer, Barthélemy Castellan du Vernet, a man hardened by a military upbringing and determined to impose order even on the edge of despair. Castellan organized the survivors into camps, yet the brutal racial hierarchy that had existed aboard the ship followed them onto land. The French crew claimed the best ground and hoarded the few barrels of wine and water that had washed ashore. The Malagasy, already weakened from weeks of captivity, were forced into a separate camp downwind and downslope, with little to no access to supplies. Within 3 days, the cruelty of this arrangement became undeniable. While the French rationed carefully and preserved their strength, 30 Malagasy perished from thirst and exhaustion. Not a single French sailor died. One officer, recording the moment in his journal, coldly observed, "The blacks are dying at an alarming rate. We must dig for water, or none will survive to help us escape." That was the key. Even here, stranded in desolation, the Malagasy were not seen as human beings, but as tools for the French. Still, desperation forced change. Castellan ordered everyone, French and Malagasy alike, to dig. Through coral sand and rock they cut, and at last, 5 meters down, their shovels struck moisture. The water was brackish and barely drinkable, but it was water nonetheless. It gave them life, and it gave Castellan the clarity his captain lacked. If anyone was to escape this island, French or Malagasy, it would only happen if they worked together. By August of 1761, the island had transformed into a makeshift shipyard. Under Castellan's command, survivors labored to build a new vessel from the shattered remains of Luteil. Timber was salvaged from the wreck, metal heated in makeshift forges, nails hammered from scraps. In the blinding sun, on an island that baked like an oven, the Malagasy labored harder than anyone. Why? Because Castellan made them a promise. He swore that once they reached civilization, he would immediately send a ship to rescue those left behind. He even wrote it down in a certificate of honor, signed by 28 French officers, praising their conduct and guaranteeing their salvation. For 2 months, work continued until at last a vessel emerged. 33 feet long, 13 feet wide, it was little more than an oversized lifeboat. They christened it La Providence. But there was an unspoken truth, heavy and bitter. The boat could not carry everyone. It had space for only 120. On September 27, 1761, the day of departure, that truth became reality. 122 French crew members climbed aboard, including Captain Lafargue, who had finally roused from his stupor just in time to secure his place. They loaded salvaged possessions, even a portable altar and crucifix from the ship's chapel, onto the boat. And then they turned their backs on 60 Malagasy men and women, including the pregnant Tamavo, who stood on the shore. Before leaving, Castellan addressed those they abandoned. Witnesses would later say tears filled his eyes as he swore on his honor as both officer and Christian that he would return. He left them tools, weapons, a few months of food, and instructions for survival. The Providence pushed out into the surf, French sailors rowing toward salvation. From the water's edge, the Malagasy called out. Some cried, some prayed, and one voice, strong above the others, shouted words that Castellan never forgot. "You will not forget us." It was not a plea, it was a curse. And then they were gone. The Providence slipped over the horizon, and the 60 abandoned souls turned back to their prison of sand and coral. They had been condemned not to months of waiting, but to 15 long years. 15 years of storms, of hunger, of sun and salt and survival. 15 years of resilience against a world that had chosen to discard them. They had been left to die, but they refused to oblige. October of 1761 brought with it a small miracle. Against every expectation, the battered French vessel La Providence managed to limp its way to Madagascar after 4 grueling days at sea. The man responsible for its survival, Castellan, wasted no time once his feet touched the ground. He hurried to the French naval commander stationed at Foul Point and delivered his report with urgency. 60 souls remained stranded on Isle des Sables, he explained breathlessly. They had played a crucial role in saving his own crew, and now their lives depend on immediate rescue. A ship had to be sent at once. The commander, however, simply shook his head. The French Navy was stretched too thin, he explained, and the British controlled these waters. There were no vessels to spare. Castellan's jaw tightened. If the Navy would not help, then he would go to Mauritius himself. The governor there, he insisted, would surely see reason. In November, Castellan finally arrived at Port Louis and stood before Governor de Forge Bush, hope still clinging to him. But what he found there was not sympathy, only cold calculation. The governor's voice carried a chilling weight as he asked, "You expect me to risk a ship and crew for contraband?" The words struck Castellan like a blow. He argued fiercely, insisting these were not contraband, but people, human beings who had shown bravery and resilience. Yet the governor was unmoved. Lafar, the captain who had defied orders and acquired those captives, had caused this disaster, and now the consequences would remain with them. Let it end there, he declared. Castellan was stunned. He had given those abandoned people his word, a promise that they would not be forgotten. But the governor sneered. "Your word? You gave your word to property, illegal property. The answer is no." For the next 8 relentless months, Castellan refused to accept defeat. He petitioned officials across Mauritius, wrote letter after letter, and even attempted to mount a private rescue. In January 1762, he came heartbreakingly close, nearly reaching the island before being forced to turn back. But the governor's stance never wavered. Whispers spread in the colony that Bush himself profited from the slave trade and wanted no disruption to the fragile economics of supply and demand. Others believed this was simply punishment by proxy, a way to make an example of Lafar's disobedience. Whatever the truth, the result was mercilessly the same. By August 1762, Castellan was broken, both in body and in spirit. He returned to France with nothing left to give, except for the haunting memory of 60 faces watching him sail away, carrying a promise he could never keep. On Tromelin Island, the abandoned captives transformed despair into something extraordinary. Deprived of rescue, they began to weave a fragile society out of survival. They learned to live by the rhythm of their harsh prison. From November to March, seabirds nested and laid eggs by the thousands. From December to February, sea turtles crawled ashore under the cover of moonless nights. At low tide, fish gathered in shallow pools where quick hands could catch them. Using blocks of coral, they built shelters with walls a meter thick, fortresses that could withstand the cyclones which battered the island with terrifying regularity. The act of building with stone broke a profound cultural taboo. In Madagascar, stone was reserved only for tombs. But the taboo had to be broken. Survival demanded it. From the copper of the wrecked ship, they fashioned tools, spoons, bowls, even jewelry. Small acts of creation became quiet affirmations of humanity in a place stripped of it. A fire was kept alive at all times, fed by wreckage, seaweed, and driftwood. It burned like a sacred flame, a tether to hope, a signal that one day rescue might come. Weeks turned into months. Months blurred into years, and still life continued. A woman named Simo gave birth to a daughter. Another woman bore a son. Their first words were in Malagasy, their first steps on burning sand, their first meals roasted tern and turtle eggs. The women proved especially resilient, leading the gathering of food, the catching of birds, and the endless maintenance of survival. But surviving was not the same as living. 2 years after the wreck, faith began to wither. Some could no longer endure the waiting. 18 of them, both men and women, resolved to take destiny into their own hands. With the last timbers of the wreck, they built a raft. It was crude, lashed together with ropes twisted from plant fibers and even strands of their own hair. A sail of cloth and feathers caught the wind. On the morning of departure, those leaving embraced those who stayed. Mothers kissed daughters. Friends who had endured the unthinkable together whispered their farewells. One man promised, "If we reach Madagascar, we will send help." A woman asked softly, "And if you don't?" No one dared answer. Everyone knew what 450 kilometers of open ocean meant for 18 desperate souls. The raft slipped into the waves, a fragile hope that dwindled into a speck on the horizon, never to be seen again. Their numbers fell to 42. With the raft went not only lives, but also their last reserves of wood and cloth. From that day forward, escape would demand even greater desperation. The seasons continued their punishing cycle. Then came the cyclones, storms so fierce they erased the island itself. French colonial records spoke of it with chilling detachment. During hurricanes, Tromelin simply disappeared beneath the sea. For the castaways, it was hell on earth. Winds screamed at over 200 kilometers per hour, driving walls of water across the sandbar. Entire shelters vanished under waves. In those moments, families clung to their coral-built homes like lifeboats, huddling in darkness while the sea tried to erase them. Children screamed. Adults prayed in Malagasy to their god, Andrea Manitra, and to their ancestors, begging for deliverance. And still, each time, when the storm passed, some of them remained. They rebuilt. They rekindled their fire. They carried on. By 1770, 9 years had passed. Only 15 survived. Mothers had buried children. The old had walked into the sea and never returned. The ones left standing were mostly women, whose strength astonished even later French reports. A grandmother emerged as the matriarch. Her daughter, grown to adulthood, helped lead. They formed a council, echoing the village gatherings of their homeland. They marked time not by years, but by the migrations of birds and the nesting of turtles. They invented a Creole language, blending Malagasy with scraps of French learned from sailors. They stopped expecting rescue, but they did not stop living. 12 years after the wreck, hope unexpectedly returned. A woman gathering eggs spotted a sail on the horizon. The survivors raced to the beach, piling everything burnable onto their signal fire until black smoke poured into the sky. They waved scraps of cloth, shouted until their voices cracked. The ship drew near, and for the first time in over a decade, hope burst open in their chests. But the reef was merciless. Every attempt to land ended in splintered boats. The ship circled twice, searching for a passage that did not exist. At sunset, it sailed away. The cruelty of that moment crushed them. Some refused to leave the beach for days, convinced it would return. Others sank into despair so deep they simply stopped eating. But the grandmother gathered them once more. Her words, spoken in Malagasy, gave them strength. If one ship had found them, others could too. They would endure. She was right. In 1774, another ship tried and failed. In 1775, a third attempt arrived. The vessel was the Grasshopper. In August of that year, for the first time in 14 years, another human being set foot on Tromelin. A French sailor, flung ashore by waves after his boat was wrecked on the reef, rose from the surf to find himself surrounded by survivors. Tears streamed down their faces as they embraced him, speaking a language he could not understand, but with meaning that needed no translation. They tended his wounds. They shared what little food they had. Through gestures and broken words, he convinced them that rescue was possible, but only if they built one last raft. With almost no wood left, the survivors turned to what remained around them. Thousands of feathers plucked from seabirds were twisted and braided into ropes and sails. At last, they fashioned a raft, fragile but afloat. 7 people boarded alongside the French sailor, 3 men and 3 women from the island. Those left behind stood on the shore, among them the grandmother and a young mother holding her baby. They watched as the raft pushed into the surf, rose over the breakers, and disappeared into the current. Did they know, as they waved goodbye, that they would never see their companions again? The ocean that had imprisoned them for 14 years swallowing their last hope as easily as it had the first. On Tromelin, only 7 women and a single infant remained. They were the final chapter of a story that stretched across generations of suffering and survival. Their endurance against storms, hunger, despair, and abandonment became more than just survival. It became a testament to the will of humanity to cling to life, even when the world seemed determined to take it away. By 1776, life on Tromelin had been stripped down to its most fragile essence. Only 7 women remained, along with an infant boy just 8 months old. The eldest was a grandmother, kept alive more by willpower than by age. Her daughter beside her, middle-aged now, hardened by 15 years of survival. Among the 5 younger women stood Timavo, the humble one, with her infant son in her arms. The child's father was gone, one of the men who had set out on the feather raft, never to return. That boy would never know him. These 7 women had endured what 60 others could not. They had weathered cyclones that drowned their island, watched 5 rescue attempts fail, and buried husbands, children, and friends in shallow sand graves. And yet, every morning, one of them still lit the fire that had burned for 15 years without pause. Every day, they still collected eggs, caught fish, and waited for the rare rainwater. Every night, they sang the old Malagasy songs, passing them down to the child who knew no other world. They fashioned clothes from bird feathers, washed with sand and precious drops of water, and preserved their dignity where almost any other group would have surrendered to despair. Then came November 25, 1776. In Mauritius, a young French naval officer, Jacques-Marie de Tromelin, received his orders. Only 25 years old, he was already known as capable and thoughtful. But this mission was unlike any other. The governor told him plainly, previous missions had failed. This one could not. Tromelin studied every report. The reef had been the killer each time. Standard shipboats shattered against it. His solution was simple but brilliant. He brought a shallow Malagasy canoe, a pirogue, that could skim coral. He also brought experienced Malagasy rowers, men who knew how to read reef waters. On November 28th, Tromelin's corvette sighted the island. On the 29th, the sea stilled, an almost unheard-of calm around Tromelin. Tromelin seized the moment. The 7 women saw the ship. They had seen ships before. They had learned not to hope. But then they saw something different, a small boat threading the reef, men walking up their beach. The eldest woman dropped to her knees. The others stood frozen, afraid to breathe lest the vision vanish. Lieutenant Liege, the officer in charge, approached. He had been told what to expect, but the sight stopped him cold. 7 women, draped in garments made of bird feathers, dignified after 15 years of abandonment. A baby in his mother's arms. A fire burning behind them. One woman, perhaps the grandmother, stepped forward. In broken French, she said, "You return." And Liege answered, "Yes, we've come to take you home." The dam broke. 15 years of endurance, of holding back despair, of keeping themselves human when the world had abandoned them, it all came pouring out. They wept, they sang, they prayed in Malagasy, thanking their ancestors. As they prepared to leave, one woman pointed at the fire and said in Malagasy, then halting French, "Simati, jamais mort," The fire never died. On December 14, 1776, Tromelin's ship entered Port Louis harbor with the women and child aboard. Word spread instantly. These were the forgotten captives of Tromelin, long thought dead. The governor himself came to greet them. He was stunned by their dignity. His first act was decisive. He declared them free. They had been enslaved illegally, abandoned cruelly, but now at last they were free persons. Yet when offered passage back to Madagascar, the women refused. They explained that if they returned, they would only be enslaved again. They had no family, no protection, no village to claim them. They would be taken by the first chief or trader who saw them. It was a devastating truth. Home was no longer home. So the governor did something remarkable. He welcomed the grandmother, her daughter, and the child into his own household. On December 15th, the baby was baptized. Jacques Moïse Tamavo. Jacques for the governor, Moïse, Moses, because he had been delivered from the waters, and Tamavo, his mother's name, the humble one. Meanwhile, across the sea in France, Barthélemy Castellon du Vivier, the man who had fought for 15 years to see these people rescued, received the news. Out of the 60 he had left behind, only 7 women and a child had survived. He wrote one final note, a confession. They kept the fire burning, he admitted. While I failed to keep my word, they kept their faith. His guilt had driven him to keep agitating, and that persistence had saved their lives. In Paris, philosophers and abolitionists seized on the story. The women of Tromelin became symbols of both human cruelty and human resilience. Their survival proved not just endurance, but dignity. Archaeologists centuries later would find the traces of their lives. Copper bowls, shell ornaments, bird bones showing years of skillful hunting, even a tiny copper comb, evidence that even in exile they maintained their humanity. And through it all, there was no evidence of violence, no signs of civil war or domination among the abandoned. 60 people stranded for 15 years could have torn each other apart. Instead, they built a society. They cared for their children and their elders. They kept singing. They lived and died with dignity. The plaque on the island today reads, "To the memory of the slaves abandoned on Tromelin Island in 1761. Abandoned, but not forgotten. Their story still burns, like the fire they never let die. And that is the true story of the forgotten captives of Tromelin Island, a story of unthinkable cruelty and of extraordinary survival. A story that asks us, could you have endured 15 years of despair and still found the strength to keep the fire alive? Leave a comment with your thoughts. And for more stories of survival against impossible odds, stay tuned because there's another waiting right here.